the silent dreams.
Welcome. Come in from the cold. Wherever you are right now, whatever room, whatever city, whatever hour it happens to be, I want you to know that you have arrived somewhere safe. This is a place without urgency, without demands, without anything required of you at all except the smallest and most natural thing in the world, to rest. You have been moving through your day for a long time now. The day asked a great deal of you, as days tend to do. It asked you to think, to decide, to navigate, to respond. It asked you to be present in 100 small ways, and you were. You showed up. And now the day is finished, and it is asking nothing more of you, and you are free. You are free to let your body be heavy. You are free to let your thoughts slow down, not forced into silence, but simply allowed to lose their urgency, the way a river loses speed when it enters a wide, shallow lake. The thoughts can still be there. They simply do not need to go anywhere in particular anymore. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Fill your lungs from the very bottom. Let your belly expand first, then your ribs, then the very top of your chest. Hold it for just a moment at the top. And then let it go. A long, slow exhale through your mouth. Let your shoulders fall on that breath. Let your jaw unclench. Let the weight of your body settle down into whatever is beneath you. Take another breath if you need it. There is no hurry. There is nowhere to be. The only thing happening right now is this: a voice, a story, and the quiet arrival of sleep. Tonight, we are going somewhere very particular. We are going back to the valley we have visited before, the Derbyshire Valley, where the River Severn runs narrow and cold between limestone banks, where Thornfield Manor sits grey and patient on the hill, and where, 2 miles below, the small village of Wychford-on-Severn has been doing what it does for 7 centuries, simply continuing. But something has changed since our last visit. The snow is gone. The winter that brought Eleanor Voss to the manor library and Edmund Clare to the inn has passed. The drifts that buried the garden walls have melted away down the hillside. The ice on the river broke up in February, and the water runs clear and quick again between its banks. The frozen ground has softened, and from that softened ground, tentatively at first and then with gathering confidence, the spring is arriving. Tonight we are going to follow a man who has been in this valley for 5 years and who, for the first time, is truly seeing it. His name is Thomas Alderton. He is the vicar of St. Cuthbert's Church in Wychford, and he is 33 years old, and he has a notebook in his coat pocket, and he has just, at the suggestion of a botanist he met one December in a snowbound inn, begun to write things down. This is the story of that spring. Make yourself comfortable, let your eyes close, and let the valley come back to life around you. The valley woke slowly, as it always did. Not all at once, not in the dramatic, cinematic way of stories about spring, where one morning everything is suddenly green and the birds are singing in full chorus, and the world seems to have made a decision overnight. It was never like that in the Derbyshire hills. Spring came here incrementally, cautiously, like a person who has been badly cold before and does not quite trust the warmer air yet. It arrived in small installments, a snowdrop here, a patch of softened ground there. A morning when the temperature was, almost imperceptibly, slightly higher than the morning before. Thomas Alderton had watched 5 springs arrive in this valley. He knew its rhythms by now, or thought he did. He knew that the blackthorn flowered before the hawthorn, white against bare branches, bright enough to seem improbable. He knew that the lapwings returned to the upper meadows in March, tumbling and calling in their extraordinary display flights, before the warmth had properly established itself. He knew that the riverside willows showed their yellow-green first, always ahead of the other trees, as though they couldn't wait. He had known all of this, but he had not, until this spring, written any of it down. This seemed, in retrospect, a peculiar omission. He had been keeping a journal since he was 18, a personal journal, theological reflections and parish notes, and the occasional poem attempted and then crossed out. He was a man who expressed himself in writing. It was simply that the natural history of the valley had existed in his awareness as background rather than subject, a pleasant setting for his life rather than a thing worthy of attention in its own right. Edmund Clare had changed this. Or rather, Edmund Clare had said something on a snowbound Sunday in December that had lodged in Thomas's mind like a seed in a crack of stone, and had been working on him quietly through the remaining winter months, and had finally, in March, produced its first shoot. What Clare had said was simple: the observations are the science. You're already doing the hard part. Thomas had been doing the hard part for 5 years without knowing it, walking the moors every week, noting changes in the bird populations, watching the heather and the bog and the movement of the weather across the upland. Doing it because he loved the landscape, and because walking was how he thought, and because the moors in all conditions were, to him, one of the places where he felt most clearly whatever it was he was attempting to feel clearly when he stood at his altar on Sunday mornings. He had not written it down. In March he bought a notebook. It was a plain thing, green cloth covers, good paper, the kind sold by the stationer in the market town. He bought it on a Tuesday afternoon when he had gone in to collect the parish correspondence and a new supply of candles, and he carried it home in his coat pocket and set it on his desk and looked at it for 3 days before he wrote anything in it. What stopped him was not reluctance. It was something more like reverence, the feeling, irrational but persistent, that once he began, the observations would become fixed and formal, and some quality of the walking itself would be lost. That nomming and recording would somehow diminish the thing being named and recorded. He thought about this for 3 days. On the 4th day he walked to the moors in the early morning, when the light was still pale and the dew was heavy on the dead grass of the previous year's growth, and he stood on the high edge of the valley and looked down at the village below. The church tower, the rooftops, the river catching what light there was, the bare trees just beginning, to show the first suggestions of bud. He felt what he always felt in that place at that hour. He went home and opened the notebook and wrote, April 3rd, morning from the high ridge, the valley is waking. And then he kept writing. By the end of that first day, he had filled 4 pages. By the end of the first week, 12. The observations poured out of him with the ease of something that had been waiting, not forced, not constructed, simply present and ready. 5 years of looking were already inside him. The notebook was simply where they went. The spring arrived around him as he wrote, and he wrote as the spring arrived, and the two things became, that April, inseparable. Thomas Alderton had not planned to be a country vicar. This was not a complaint. He had, over 5 years in Wychford, arrived at a profound contentment with his life here, a contentment that still occasionally surprised him when he stopped to consider it. But in the years before Wychford, his intentions had been different. He had come down from Oxford with a first in theology and a vague expectation that his path would lead through the ecclesiastical institutions of the Church of England toward something. He had been uncertain of the shape of it, but the outline had involved a cathedral city, a position of scholarly significance, perhaps eventually a professorship or a deanship, something that used the full extent of what he had learned. What he had been offered in the year of his ordination was Wychford. The parish was small and the stipend modest, and the previous incumbent had been in his 70s and had, by the end of his tenure, reduced the intellectual content of the Sunday sermon to approximately 3 minutes, which had suited most of the congregation very well. The bishop had asked Thomas to take it as a temporary placement while a more suitable post was found. That had been 5 years ago, and no other post had been offered, and Thomas had stopped expecting one. He had stopped expecting one because he had stopped wanting one. This was the thing that surprised him still, not the gradual accommodation to a smaller life than he had imagined, but the discovery that the life was not smaller at all. It was differently shaped. It had a quality that his Oxford years, with all their intellectual stimulation and social activity and sense of important things being done by important people in important rooms, had conspicuously lacked. It had the particular quality of a place that needed him specifically. Not his credentials, not his academic distinction. Him, Thomas Alderton, who had grown up in a Shropshire market town and knew how to talk to farmers and who had, entirely unexpectedly, turned out to be genuinely good at sitting with people in difficult moments, at finding the right word in the small hours, at being present without being intrusive. The people of Wychford had educated him in this without quite intending to. They had shown him, through 5 years of births and deaths and marriages and the ordinary crises of ordinary lives, what the work actually was. Not the theology, though he continued to find the theology absorbing and continued to preach sermons of a length and intellectual substance that occasionally alarmed his congregation, and just as often secretly pleased them. But beneath the theology, the actual work, presence, attention. The willingness to be where you were, with the people who were there, without wishing you were somewhere more significant. He was a tall man, slightly angular, with the kind of face that looked younger than its age at rest and older when concentrated. The face of someone whose resting expression was mild and open but who became, when thinking hard about something, temporarily severe. His hair was very dark and slightly disordered, and he was always meaning to have it cut and never getting around to it. He wore his cassock for services and his ordinary clothes for everything else. A worn tweed coat that had seen 4 winters and which he was deeply reluctant to replace. A series of knitted scarves that had been given to him by various parishioners over the years. Practical boots for the moors. He lived in the vicarage, which was a low stone house beside the church, separated from the churchyard by a stone wall over which the yew trees leaned with their ancient, unhurried darkness. The vicarage had a garden, a proper kitchen garden at the back and a small formal garden at the front, both of which he tended himself on the grounds that gardening was a form of thinking, and he did some of his best work there. He was, in most respects, a happy man. But there was a quality to his happiness before this spring that he would later identify as incomplete, not unhappy, not dissatisfied, but not quite fully present either. The moors were there, the river was there, the valley was doing its seasonal things all around him, and he was aware of it and grateful for it, but he was aware of it the way you are aware of music playing in another room, pleasant, present, but not quite attended to. The notebook changed this. With the notebook came a different quality of attention, not the ambient appreciation of a man who loves his landscape, but the specific, directed, alert attention of a man who is trying to get something exactly right, trying to find the word that describes precisely this shade of green on this particular morning at this particular hour, trying to record not just what he saw but what it was like to see it, the quality of the looking, the feeling of the cold air, the sound of the river, the way the light moved across the hillside. He had not expected this to feel like prayer. It did. The first entry in Thomas Alderton's Natural History notebook read as follows. April 3rd, morning, from the high ridge, the valley is waking. The river has its full voice back. I had not noticed during the winter how much it had quieted under the ice, but now it is clear that the sound I have been hearing all winter was only a fraction of what the river actually says. The full spring river is a different instrument entirely, more variable, more present. On the way up, a pair of stone chats on the gorse, the male very bright. 3 curlews calling over the upper moor, the first curlews of the year. The call of a curlew in April is one of the most affecting sounds I know, and I have never attempted to say why. Something about its length and its falling quality. Something about the distance it carries. The blackthorn is out on the south-facing bank below the ridge, white against bare wood. The hawthorn is not yet. 2, perhaps 3 weeks. I stood for a long time. The light was the particular light of early April mornings, pale but not gray, the color of the inside of a shell. It will take weeks yet for the trees to leaf fully. For now, the valley is still legible. You can see through it to the structure beneath, the shape of the hills, the course of the river, the bones of the landscape before the flesh of summer covers them. I should have been doing this for years. He paused when he wrote that last line and read it back. Then he crossed it out. Not because it was untrue, it was entirely true, but because regret was not the spirit in which he wanted to keep this record. He wanted the notebook to be present tense. Not a document of what had been missed, but of what was here now today, on this morning in April, in this valley that was waking up around him. He wrote instead, "I am starting now." Over the following days, the notebook grew. He wrote in it every morning, before the first of his parish duties, sitting at the desk in his study with the window slightly open, and the garden visible, and the birdsong coming in with the cool air. He wrote what he had observed on the previous day's walk, and sometimes he wrote what he could see or hear from the window, and sometimes the writing started with a single specific observation and expanded outward, the way a stone dropped in still water expands in rings. On April 6th, he wrote about the primroses along the churchyard wall, pale yellow, growing in the grass at the base of the stone, a color so specific that he spent a whole paragraph trying to name it accurately. Not yellow exactly, not cream, something between the two with a slight warmth in it, a faint suggestion of the sun they were reaching toward. He settled, eventually, on the color of very early morning light before it has decided to be gold. On April 9th, he wrote about the lapwings. He had observed them for years on the upper meadows, knew their tumbling display flights, their extraordinary calls, their persistent attachment to the same fields year after year. But this year, writing about them, he found himself asking questions he had not asked before. Why those particular fields? What did the lapwings know about that ground that he did not? What was the quality of that meadow, the soil, the drainage, the specific mix of grasses, that made it suitable in a way that the adjacent fields were not? He wrote 3 pages and ended with a list of questions rather than answers, which seemed to him entirely satisfactory. On April 12th, he wrote about rain. Not the rain itself. He had written about rain many times in his personal journal, usually in the context of cancelled outdoor parish activities and the philosophical acceptance of English weather. But this time he wrote about what rain did to the valley, the way it changed the color of the limestone from pale cream to dark gray, the way the river rose and changed its voice, the way the new leaves on the hawthorn, just beginning to show now, the faintest green haze on the dark branches, caught the rain and held it in small bright drops that caught the light when the clouds parted. He was surprised to discover that writing about the valley made him love it more. This seemed counterintuitive. He would have expected the act of analysis, the nomming and categorizing and describing, to diminish the thing described, the way dissection reveals the mechanism at the cost of the mystery. But it did not work that way. The opposite, in fact. The closer he looked, the more there was to see. The more precisely he tried to describe a thing, the more he became aware of what the description couldn't capture, the full sensory reality of being there, in that light, with that particular cold April wind on his face and the curlew calling somewhere above him. The notebook was not a replacement for the walking. It was a reason to walk more attentively. He began waking earlier, not by intention, not by setting an alarm or making a resolution, but simply by waking, as his body adjusted to the lengthening days and the earlier birdsong and the new quality of the spring mornings that was different from winter mornings, in a way he was only now beginning to appreciate. He would wake at 5:30 or 6, before the village stirred, and lie for a moment in the particular gray-blue light of a spring dawn, and then get up and put on his coat and go outside. These early mornings became the best hours of his day. The moors above Wychford were different in spring. Thomas had walked them in all seasons and had his preferences: autumn for the heather color and the particular quality of the October light, winter for the severity and the way the snow simplified everything to its essential lines and forms, summer for the warmth and the fullness of the vegetation and the long evenings that made a 6-hour walk possible without effort. But spring, he was discovering, was the most interesting. Spring was when things were becoming. The moor in April was not yet what it would be, not the full summer moorland with its heather in bloom and its meadow pipits and its high, wide sky of settled weather. It was something in between, the remnants of winter still present in the dead brown grass and the bare patches where the frost had been hardest, and threaded through it and pushing up from beneath it, the insistent green of the new growth. The two things coexisted on the spring moor with a naturalness that Thomas found, the more he looked at it, quietly extraordinary. He walked to the high edge on the morning of April 14th, a Saturday, his lightest day in terms of parish duties, setting out at 6 with the notebook in his pocket and his field glass, which was an old brass instrument that had belonged to his father and which he had carried on walks since boyhood without, until this year, looking through it with any particular concentration. The morning was cold, properly cold still, a last reminder from the winter that it had not entirely relinquished its hold. His breath was visible. The dew on the dead grass made the path slightly treacherous in places, the ground soft underfoot but not boggy. The light was the level, shadowless light of early morning before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. He heard the curlews before he saw them. 3 of them, calling from the upper meadow, that long, falling, impossible cry that seemed to come from somewhere older than the birds themselves, to have been built into the landscape before the birds arrived to make it. He stopped walking when he heard it and stood still. He had heard curlews hundreds of times on this moor, but now, with the notebook in his pocket and the particular quality of attention he had been practicing for the past 2 weeks, he heard it differently. He stood still for a full minute, just listening, not moving toward the sound or reaching for the field glass, just listening to it repeat one bird, then answering silence, then another, then a third, with the patience that the notebook had been teaching him. He wrote later, back at the vicarage desk. April 14th. The curlews again. 3. I stood still for perhaps a minute before moving closer, which I have never done before, have always walked immediately toward the sound. This morning I stood and simply heard it first. I think this was the right thing to do. There is a quality to the curlew's call that requires a certain stillness before it reveals itself fully, like a piece of music that you have to stop talking to actually hear. The call has 3 distinct phases: the initial probe, which is almost exploratory, testing the air; then the fall, long and uneven, dropping in pitch but not quite predictably, so that you can never quite anticipate the bottom of it; then the silence after, which is as much a part of the call as the sound itself. The silence is where the moor answers. He moved closer eventually, and found them in the upper meadow. 3 large, brown, long-billed birds moving through the rough grass with a deliberate, unhurried quality that he associated with the moor itself, as though the birds and the landscape had reached an agreement about pace a long time ago, and were both committed to honoring it. He watched them through the field glass for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. He had never, in 5 years of walking this moor, spent 20 minutes watching a single group of birds. There had always been something else, the walk to complete, the time to manage, the parish to return to. The walk had been an interval between duties rather than a thing in its own right, and he had moved through it at the pace of an interlude rather than the pace of attention. Now he had the notebook, and the notebook required time. He found on that April morning that giving time to one thing was not the deprivation he might have feared. He did not feel, watching the curlews for 20 minutes, that he was missing the rest of the moor. He felt, instead, that he was inhabiting the moor more completely in those 20 minutes than he had on any of his previous 5 years of walks across it. The concentrated attention was not a reduction of experience. It was an amplification of it. He walked on eventually up to the ridge and along it, and the morning opened around him as the light strengthened, the valley below visible in its entirety, the manor on the opposite hill just catching the first direct sun, its stone the color of honey in that light. He could see the village, the church tower, the rooftops, the thin blue lines of smoke from the morning fires. He could see the river, a silver line through the valley floor, moving quickly after the recent rain. He stood on the ridge and looked at it all. He thought about Eleanor Voss in the manor library. He had heard something of her stay from Mrs. Draycott's cousin, who attended his church and was a reliable source of information about the comings and goings of the great house. A book cataloger, working through the winter. He had never met her, but he felt, looking at the manor from the ridge, a kind of neighborly warmth towards someone who had, apparently, spent a winter learning to be still. He thought about Edmund Clare in the inn, with his press specimens and his field journal, waking at strange hours to watch the sparrows. He thought, we were all here in the same winter, all of us learning the same lesson from different directions. He took out his notebook and wrote this down. The church garden was Thomas's private project. Not the churchyard, that was common ground, maintained with the help of 2 parishioners and a boy with a scythe who came monthly. The church garden was a separate thing, a small walled area behind the vestry, south-facing, that had apparently been used as a kitchen garden by an earlier incumbent, and had been allowed to lapse into a tangle of couch grass and nettles sometime in the 1860s. Thomas had been clearing and replanting it for 3 years, in the spare hours between parish duties, with no particular plan and no professional knowledge of horticulture. It showed both qualities, the lack of plan and the lack of knowledge, but he was fond of it anyway, with the particular fondness one has for imperfect things one has made oneself. In April, the garden came back with a confidence that always surprised him, despite 3 years of seeing it happen. The bulbs he had planted in autumn came up through the cold soil, small narcissi, white and cream, clusters of them along the south wall. The old roses that had been in the garden before he started, 2 large climbers of uncertain variety, whose identity he had given up trying to establish, showed their first leaves in the 3rd week of March, each leaf so precisely and perfectly made that he had spent a morning once examining a single new rose leaf under a magnifying glass, and had ended up filling 2 pages of notes about its structure. He came to the garden most mornings before breakfast, when the dew was still heavy and the light was still forming, and did an hour's quiet work, weeding, turning, tying in, the small maintenance tasks that a garden requires but that did not demand much thought and left his mind free to do its own work. He had been keeping the natural history notebook for 2 weeks when he began also keeping notes in it about the garden. This had not been his intention. Clare had said the moors, the natural landscape, the kind of systematic field observation that had scientific value. A small, imperfect, private church garden was hardly the same thing. But one morning in mid-April, he was kneeling in the garden-turning soil near the south wall, and a bumblebee arrived. It was the first bumblebee of the year, a large, immaculately clean buff-tailed queen, emerging from whatever concealment she had used through the winter. She was enormous compared to his memory of summer bees. Queens always are in spring, before the workers appear, and she moved over the garden with a quality of purposeful investigation that he found immediately absorbing. He stopped weeding and watched her. She worked methodically along the south wall, visiting the narcissi one by one. He could see, from where he was kneeling, the pollen baskets on her hind legs filling, the bright orange-yellow accumulating as she worked. The weight of it visible in the way she moved, slightly slower and more deliberate as the baskets grew heavy. She seemed to him completely and utterly focused, not in any way that implied intelligence or intention beyond the biological, but in the deep, functional sense of an organism doing exactly what it was designed to do, with no part of itself withheld or distracted. He watched her for 20 minutes. Then he wrote about her for 20 minutes. Then he went inside and had his breakfast and read his morning office and prepared his Sunday sermon. And the day continued as days continue, full of its usual variety of demands and satisfactions and small, unremarkable moments. But the bumblebee was with him through all of it. Not as a thought, he was not thinking about the bumblebee, but as a quality in the day. A kind of groundedness. The feeling of having been, for those 20 minutes in the cold April garden, completely and simply present in the world. Not performing presence. Not practicing mindfulness or engaging in any deliberate spiritual exercise. Simply kneeling in the soil watching a bee do what bees do and being, for that time, nothing other than the person watching. He wrote in the notebook that evening, "I think this is what the natural history observation is really for. Not the data, not the record, the practice of attention itself. The repeated, daily, voluntary act of looking at something other than oneself with complete concentration." He paused. Then he added, "This is, I think, also what prayer is for. I had not noticed until now that they were the same thing." He looked at this sentence for a while. Then he did not cross it out. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in the last week of April, in the second post, along with 3 parish communications, and a catalogue from a London bookseller that Thomas had not requested but always read. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. He had seen it only once before, on a card Edmund Clare had left with Mr. Holt when he departed in January. Precise, slightly compressed, the hand of a man who wrote a great deal and had long since optimized the process for speed without sacrificing legibility. He set the other envelopes aside and opened Clare's letter first. It was 3 pages, written in London, dated April 19th. Clare wrote that he was well, that London was London, loud, fast, demanding, but that he had managed to maintain something of what he had found in Wychford. Not always. Some weeks the pace reclaimed him entirely, and he found himself moving at the old speed, making the old lists, losing the thread. But he knew now that the thread existed, which was something he had not known before December. Knowing it was there meant he could find it again. He had returned to his work at the institution with what he described as a different kind of engagement, less driven, more curious, less concerned with the products of the work and more interested in the work itself. He had started a new research project on the mycorrhizal networks in moorland peat, a subject that was purely interesting to him, that he had no immediate professional reason to pursue, that he had simply been thinking about since his walks above Wychford and had decided to follow, on the grounds that it was the thing that actually made him want to go to his desk in the morning. He had written to several colleagues about the new project and had received responses that ranged from enthusiastic to puzzled. One colleague had asked him directly why he was devoting time to a subject that was unlikely to produce significant publications in the near term. Clare wrote that he had replied by saying he was doing it because it was interesting, and because he thought it might, in 5 years, turn out to be more important than it currently appeared, and that this had not entirely satisfied his colleague but had satisfied him completely. The letter then turned to Thomas. I find myself hopping, Alderton, that you have started the notebook. I realize I have no right to hope this. It is entirely your own affair what you do with your observations. But I have been thinking since leaving Wychford about that conversation in the inn, and about the quality of what you described to me. 5 years of observation, all of it inside you, none of it written down. It seems to me, and I say this as a scientist, but also as a person who has spent the winter learning something, that written down things acquire a weight and a presence that unwritten things don't have. Not more real exactly, but differently real, more available to be returned to, more able to accumulate. In any case, the moors above Wychford are, I believe, one of the least studied upland ecosystems in Derbyshire. Whatever you have been noticing about the bird populations and the vegetation changes, it is, I can assure you, of genuine interest, not just to you. Thomas read this paragraph twice. He was aware of a feeling that he could not quite name, not quite pride, not quite gratitude, something between the two. The feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to look closely. Claire had spent 3 weeks in Wychford and had in that time, between the frozen river and the snowbound Sunday and the conversations over mutton stew, formed an impression of Thomas Alderton that was, Thomas thought, more accurate than the impression most people who had known him for years had formed. He read on. The final page of the letter was more specific. Claire had been corresponding with a colleague at the Manchester Natural History Society, who was compiling observations of upland bird populations across the Pennines and the Peak District. Would Thomas, Claire wanted to know, be willing to contribute his observations, once he had a season's worth, if he was indeed keeping the notebook, to this broader project? Nothing onerous, simply the sending of a seasonal report. But the data would be valuable, and the colleague was serious and trustworthy, and it would give Thomas's observations a context beyond the personal. Thomas set the letter down. He looked out the window at the church garden, where the narcissi were finishing, and the rose leaves were full and glossy, and the first hoverflies of the year were working the flowers along the wall. He thought, 5 weeks ago I did not have a notebook. He thought, now someone in Manchester wants my observations. He went to his desk and took out the notebook and wrote, April 26th. Letter from EC. The moors are apparently the least studied upland ecosystem in Derbyshire. I have been living on them for 5 years. I will need more notebooks. Then he wrote Claire a reply, 3 pages, mirroring Claire's length, which felt appropriate, and sent it that afternoon. He told Claire about the curlews and the bumblebee. He told him about the primroses and the color he had tried to describe as the color of very early morning light before it has decided to be gold. He told him about the notebooks. He had, by this point, nearly filled the first, and had purchased a second from the market town stationer, who had looked slightly surprised at the repetition of the order but asked no questions. He told Claire he would write to the Manchester colleague. And he told him, in the last paragraph, with the directness that 4 months of notebook keeping had given him along with other things, that the observation practice had turned out to be something he had not anticipated, that it had changed the quality of his days in a way he had not expected and would not have been able to predict, that he went to his work now, the parish work, the sermons, the sitting with people in difficult hours, with something that he could only describe as more of himself present, as though the attention he gave to the curlews in the morning had expanded somehow to include the afternoon parishioner across his desk, and he was listening to that person with the same quality of ear he brought to the moors. He did not know, he wrote, if this was what Claire had intended. He suspected it was not. he suspected Claire had meant something more specifically scientific. But there it was. The observations had turned into something beyond the observations. He sealed the letter and set it on the post tray and went about his Thursday. What Thomas had not anticipated when he began the notebook was how many people already knew things. He had assumed, starting out, that he was the observer, that his accumulation of 5 years of walking would be unusual in its extent, and that the notebook would be a record of a private knowledge. He had not expected the notebook to reveal, as it quickly did, that he was surrounded by people who had been observing for much longer than he had, without notebooks, and whose knowledge of the valley made his own look like a preliminary sketch. Mr. Featherstone he had known about, of course, 81 years of the valley, the maps, the extraordinary accumulated topographical memory of a man who had surveyed this ground on foot with a theodolite in the 1840s. He had sat with Mr. Featherstone many times over 4 years, discussing the landscape and the history and the changes that had occurred, and had absorbed a great deal without quite accounting for how much. But there were others. There was Mrs. Ragg, a farmer's wife in her 60s who had been watching the upper pastures for 30 years and who knew, with a precision that astonished Thomas when she described it, which fields the lapwings chose each year and which they avoided, and what the difference was between the chosen and the unchosen grounds in terms of drainage and grass height and the timing of the cutting. She had never been asked about this before, as far as Thomas could tell. She simply knew it, as part of the business of farming, information gathered in service of practical agricultural decisions, and it had not occurred to her or to anyone else that it was also, incidentally, natural history data of considerable value. Thomas wrote it all down. He wrote down what Mrs. Ragg told him about the lapwings. He wrote down what the blacksmith, Mr. Forrest, told him about the bats that roosted in the smithy's roof beam, had roosted there for as long as he could remember, as long as his father could remember, and came back every spring on a date that Mr. Forrest could predict within a week, because it was always shortly after the swallows arrived and slightly before the martins. He wrote down what the postmistress, Miss Hartley, told him about the wild garlic in the lane behind the mill, how it came earlier every year, in her observation, the first leaves appearing a little sooner each spring than they had the spring before, and how she had noticed this over 15 years of walking the same route, and had told no one because she could not see why anyone would care. Thomas cared. He recorded her observation with the date and her estimated margin of variation, and a note about the aspect and drainage of the lane that might explain the pattern, and he wrote beside it, 15 years of phenological data on a single species in a single location, held in the memory of one person who did not know she had it. How many such observations exist in this parish alone, unrecorded, uncollected, waiting in the minds of people who have never been asked? He began asking, carefully and without making it into something large or imposing. He did not arrive at people's doors with his notebook open and announce that he was conducting a scientific survey. He simply mentioned, in the natural course of his pastoral visits and his Sunday conversations and his market day encounters, that he had been writing down what he observed on the moors, and had found it interesting, and was curious about what others had noticed. The response was, almost without exception, immediate and generous. People had been noticing things for years, decades, lifetimes. They had not been asked, and so the observations had remained personal, private, classified as not quite knowledge because they had not been endorsed by any institutional frame. Thomas's interest, the interest of the vicar, with his notebook and his letter from the London botanist and his evident genuine curiosity, provided a frame. He was not endorsing them scientifically. He lacked the authority for that. But he was telling them, implicitly, that what they had seen was worth saying. He found, over the course of April and into May, that this was one of the most satisfying things he had done in 5 years of pastoral work. Not more satisfying than sitting with a dying person or helping a family through a crisis. Those things were different in kind, not in degree, but satisfying in a distinct way. The particular satisfaction of connecting what people knew to a context larger than themselves, of showing them that the private, unremarkable knowledge accumulated through a lifetime of paying attention to a particular piece of the world was not unremarkable at all. It was, he thought, exactly the same satisfaction as a sermon done well. The moment when you saw in someone's face the recognition of something they had already half known. Thomas said evening prayer alone. This was not unusual. The evening office was not well attended on weekdays, and there were many evenings when he arrived at the church at 6 o'clock to find the pews empty and lit the 2 candles on the altar, and said the service alone, his voice quiet in the stone interior, the responses addressed to the air and the silence and whatever lay behind them. He did not mind this. In fact, on some evenings he preferred it. The solo service had a different quality from the congregational one, more intimate, less performative, the words sounding differently when there was no audience for them except the listening silence of a very old building. On the evening of May 3rd, a Friday, after a long week of parish work, a funeral on the Wednesday, and a difficult conversation with a family in trouble on the Thursday, and 2 mornings of early moor walking that had produced some of the best notebook entries yet. Thomas arrived at the church to find it empty and lit the candles, and stood for a moment before beginning. The church had been standing for 700 years. He thought about this sometimes, most evenings if he was honest, in the moment before the service began. 700 years of this. The candles, the words, the stone, the silence. Generation after generation of people coming to this building with their ordinary lives and their extraordinary sorrows and their persistent, unreasonable, apparently indestructible need to say something, however uncertain, however formal, however awkward, in the direction of whatever it was they could not quite see. He began. The words of evensong were very old and very familiar. He had said them thousands of times. He knew them completely, knew them so well that there was a risk, which he was aware of and resisted, of saying them without being present in them, of the words passing through him like water through a pipe. He had developed over 5 years small practices to prevent this, a deliberate slowness, a pause between phrases, the occasional different emphasis that recalled the actual meaning rather than the familiar sound. Tonight the practices were not necessary. Tonight, for reasons he would think about later, the words arrived already full. He thought it was something to do with the notebook, with the 2 weeks of morning observation and the quality of attention it had been building, gradually, like layers of sediment. The attention he brought to the curlew's call, the bee's flight, the exact color of the primrose. The same attention seemed to be present, tonight, in the stone of the church and the flame of the candles and the 700 years of the building and the familiar, ancient, astonishing fact of the words. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He said it slowly. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He stopped. He stood in the empty church in the candlelight, beside the still waters of 700 years of this particular form of human reaching toward, and he felt what he sometimes felt in that building, and sometimes did not, the sense of something present that was not himself, something that the building and the words and the long accumulation of people who had stood where he was standing had called into being, or had been pointing toward all along. He was not sure of the theology of what he felt. He was rarely sure of the theology. He was a thoughtful man with a first in theology, and he had, over the course of 33 years and 5 of them spent in pastoral work, arrived at a position on the theology that was more honest than confident. There was something. He did not know its nature precisely. But there was something, and it was not nothing, and it was accessible in certain moments, in certain qualities of attention, and this building was one of the places where those moments were more frequent than elsewhere. He finished the service. He sat for a while in the candlelight after it was over. Outside, through the high clear glass of the east window, the original east window had been leaded with colored glass, but it had been broken in a storm in the 18th century and replaced with clear glass, which Thomas privately thought was a better arrangement. The sky was a deep, fatting blue, the last of the spring evening light. A blackbird was singing somewhere in the churchyard, its evensong overlapping with his. The same impulse, Thomas thought, expressed in different registers. He took out his notebook. He wrote May 3rd evening, empty church. The service, the blackbird outside, these things are not separate. He looked at this sentence. Then he closed the notebook and sat in the quiet for a while longer, until the candles needed attention. By the middle of May, the valley had arrived. There was a particular moment each year, Thomas knew it now, after 5 springs, when spring stopped being something that was happening and became something that had happened. When the balance tipped from becoming to being, and the valley settled into its summer mode. The trees fully leafed, the meadow grasses tall, the hedges thick with hawthorn blossom, and the hedgerow flowers opening one after another in their established sequence. The hawthorn was the marker. When the hawthorn flowered, the valley was full. It flowered in the 2nd week of May, and when it did, the hedges along the lane from the village to the river and up the hillside toward the moors were white, not the tentative, sparse white of the blackthorn in April, but a heavy, dense, almost extravagant whiteness that coated the dark branches in great clusters and filled the air with a scent that was sweet and slightly sharp and unmistakable, and that seemed to carry within it the whole accumulated energy of the spring, released at once. Thomas walked through the hawthorn lanes on the morning of May 14th and stopped, as he always did, to put his face close to a branch and breathe in. He wrote later, "The scent of hawthorn blossom is impossible to describe without sounding excessive. It is excessive. It is the most excessive thing the English spring does. Everything about it is too much, too white, too dense, too sweet, too present. It fills the lane entirely, not just visually but atmospherically, the air itself different, and yet it is precisely right. The valley earns it. After the long, spare winter and the tentative spring, the hawthorn is not too much. It is exactly enough." He walked to the river that morning, which was running at its good spring level, full but not flooded, clear but moving purposefully, the kingfishers visible if you knew where to look. He had seen kingfishers here before, over 4 winters of walking this bank, but had not, until this spring, spent time watching them. He spent 40 minutes watching one kingfisher on a perch above a clear pool, watching it hunt. The absolute stillness of waiting, broken by the sudden, improbably fast dive and the return, sometimes with a fish and sometimes without, to exactly the same perch. 40 minutes. He would have thought, 4 months ago, that 40 minutes watching a single bird was an indulgence he could not justify on a Tuesday morning with a full week of parish work ahead of him. He would have watched the kingfisher for 5 minutes and continued his walk, and felt pleased with himself for having noticed it. Now he knew what 40 minutes of attention produced. He knew the difference between 5 minutes and 40. 5 minutes gave you the surface, the color, the drama of the dive, the general impression. 40 minutes gave you the behavior, the pattern of the perches, the preferred angle of approach, the specific part of the pool that was hunted most intensively and what that said about where the fish were in the water. The context, the intelligence beneath the surface. He thought everything worth knowing takes time. He thought, I have been in this valley for 5 years and I have given it, on the whole, about 5 minutes of attention each visit. And now I have started giving it 40, and I am only beginning to understand what is here. He sat on the river bank for a while after the kingfisher moved on, with his notebook open, not writing, just sitting with the river and the hawthorn scent, and the sound of the water and the bird song above him. The warmth of the May morning was on his face. The grass beneath him was soft and already thick. A pair of swallows arrived, Mr. Forrest had told him, on the 8th of May, exactly as predicted, were hunting insects above the river, their flight so fluid and so fast that the eye could barely follow it, each turn and dip executed with a precision that made Thomas's attempts at the field glass absurd. He closed the notebook. He breathed in the hawthorn. He thought, I have been happy here. It arrived as a thought, quiet and certain, the way truths sometimes arrive when you stop actively pursuing them. He had been happy here, not despite the smallness of the life, not in compensation for what he had not become, but because of the specific, irreplaceable qualities of this particular valley in this particular spring, qualities that were available to him completely, and only because he had chosen to stay to look, to accumulate the particular knowledge that comes from being in one place long enough to see it change and return and change again. He thought of Harriet Ashworth's notebook, which Thomas knew of because Mrs. Draycott's cousin had mentioned it in the course of telling him about Miss Voss and the library. A young woman who had loved a room and had written about it and had died before she could finish. I have been happy here. Whatever comes next, I have had this. Thomas looked at the river. He thought, yes, whatever comes next, I have had this. He got up slowly and walked back along the hawthorn lane and through the village, nodding to Mrs. Ragg in her doorway, and to Miss Hartley crossing the green with the second post, and to the children coming out of the school at 11 for their morning break, running into the sunlight with the absolute and completely valid joy of children released from confinement on a warm May morning. He went into the church. He sat in the front pew and looked at the east window and the blue sky beyond it. He sat there for 10 minutes doing nothing. Then he went to the vicarage and wrote his Sunday sermon. It was about paying attention. It was the best sermon he had written in 5 years. And so we have come again to the end of the evening. Thomas Alderton filled 4 notebooks that spring. He sent his first seasonal report to the Manchester colleague in June, and received in return a letter of 2 pages expressing genuine interest and requesting that he continue. The Manchester colleague had not, in 20 years of compiling upland bird records, received data from this part of Derbyshire. The gap in the record, he wrote, had always troubled him. He was grateful. Thomas wrote back. He told him about Mrs. Ragg and the lapwings. He told him about Mr. Forrest and the bats. He told him about Miss Hartley and the wild garlic, 15 years of phenological observation held in the memory of a woman who had thought no one would care. The Manchester colleague wrote back a 3rd time. Eventually, 3 years later, Thomas and the Manchester colleague published a paper together. Thomas's name appeared second. The paper was small and specific and read by perhaps 300 people, most of them specialists. It described, in precise and careful language, the upland bird populations of one valley in Derbyshire over a period of observation. It cited Mrs. Ragg, in an acknowledgments footnote, as a long-term field observer of lapwing habitat selection. Thomas had shown her the footnote when the paper arrived. She had read it twice and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Well, fancy that." And she had folded it and put it in her apron pocket and carried it there for the rest of the day, which Thomas thought was exactly the right response. But all of that was later. In May of 1888, in the spring that followed the long winter of the Thornfield universe, Thomas Alderton was 33 years old and had 4 notebooks and a garden full of hawthorn scent, and a church that had been standing for 7 centuries and a valley that was, he was discovering, inexhaustible. He had everything he needed. And now, listener, you who have come with us through the April moors and the church garden and the empty evensong and the hawthorn lanes, I want you to take with you whatever part of this evening has been most yours. Perhaps it was the curlew call, and the learning to stand still before moving toward the sound. Perhaps it was the bumblebee, working the narcissi in the cold morning garden, the pollen baskets filling, the whole of its attention given to the task. Perhaps it was the empty church, and the candles and the blackbird singing its own evensong outside the clear east window. Perhaps it was simply the hawthorn. Whatever it was, it is yours. You can carry it with you into sleep. And sleep is where we are going now. Your breath is slowing. Your body is heavy and warm and completely supported. The spring evening outside is mild, the first truly mild evening, the kind where you leave the window open a little and lie in bed with the cool air on your face and the blankets warm below. And the smell of new leaves and blossom comes in on the small wind, and the last light fades slowly from the sky, and a blackbird sings from somewhere close until it is too dark to sing, and then it is quiet. Just quiet. Somewhere in a valley in Derbyshire, a young vicar is sitting in an empty church in the candlelight after evensong, with his notebook in his hand and his sermon for Sunday already forming in his mind. And outside the clear east window, the blue spring evening is deepening toward night. He is not anxious about anything. He has 4 notebooks full of what the valley has told him, and there will be more notebooks, and the valley will have more to tell. He knows the curlews will come back next April. He knows the bumblebee will come back next spring. He knows the hawthorn will flower in the second week of May, as it always has, as it always will, long after he is gone, long after the notebooks are gone. The hawthorn will flower in May in this valley, and it will be too much and it will be exactly right. That constancy is one of the most restful things there is. The world continues without our management of it. The seasons turn without our help. The birds return. The flowers come up. And you tonight, in your warm bed, with the window open or closed, with the spring night outside or the summer or the autumn or the winter, you are part of that continuity. You are a body breathing in and out, which is a miracle that requires no effort from you at all. Let your breath slow. One breath, then another. The notebook is closed. The candles are burned down. The blackbird has stopped singing. The valley is quiet. And you are here, in the deep, warm, good dark of a spring night, with nothing to do and nowhere to be, and all the hours until morning available entirely for rest. Sleep well.